Anyway, I'll try to edit that out after the fact. Tonight I'm here with John Klyczek. We are doing episode number 176 tonight, the School World Order. And sorry about the feed screwing up there, folks. Anyway, they had told me to set it that way, and it clearly didn't work properly. But yeah, so this week we had about 26 inches of snow here in my town in about, 10 hours. Some places on the mountain getting 4 feet of snow. It took the snow plows several days. Some people, it took them 5 days to get power back. Some people still don't have power. The town looked like a tornado hit it after, with downed trees, downed poles, downed everything all over the place. It was a mess. I tried to get out. I had to stop to get some stuff to go to Thanksgiving dinner. And, because I delayed leaving an extra 20, 30 minutes to get stuff together, I wasn't able to get out. So I missed Thanksgiving dinner. And then without power, barely had any heat going and all for several days. So it was pretty sucky few days there. But we're warm, we're back again. So yeah, it was pretty miserable to say the least, though. So John, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it, man.
Yeah, and you had reached out to me about your new book published by Chris Milligan over at Trying Day, School World Order. And thanks for sending me a copy of that. You autographed it for me. You cite me in your book. I appreciate that. And you get into education. You actually picked up on my work on the Trivium. You want to talk about how you came across my work before we dive in?
So originally, I actually had planned the book kind of was going to end with the chapter before the epilogue with the solutions, right? So an alternative curriculum to kind of offset all the technocratic eugenics, that type of stuff. And so basically, Chris was like, you can't just end it like that. That you're gonna terrify people, and they'll probably feel like disempowered. So you need to give them some kind of something they can do about it. And so I says, okay. And I had remembered, I had come across some of your research in some documentaries. I think State of Mind was one of them, and there were some others. And the Trivium, I just remembered that as the classical method in general. And at the time, when I got to the end of the book. And I'm kind of skipping ahead here with that. One of the questions became, it's essentially based on the empirical method. And so he needs some kind of, a priori system. Okay. And so, you can find that in the classical method through formal logic and deductive reasoning with a first cause metaphysics and things like that. And so that's essentially kind of how I came across your stuff. And I kind of dug into it as I wrote the conclusion. So my degree is in English. I teach English. It's in rhetoric. I teach rhetoric. But they didn't teach the trivium in the classical method. So, I had rhetoric, ethos, logos, pathos, a lot of deconstructionist stuff, which is the opposite of that as well. It was mainly more of that. But never a lot of formal logic, not grammar in terms of special grammar, linguistics, or philology, and then general grammar, vocabulary, right, for subject research, subject-based research. So basically, as I dug into that, and has actually changed my methodology, my pedagogy in the classroom. I do implement more, some formal logic and some more special general grammar and teach it from that framework.
Do you get into the difference between general and special grammar?
Oh yeah, absolutely, right. So the special grammar is essentially what today we would call linguistics. So it's language specific. It has to do with the way that the alphabet or the characters work in syntax. And then there's the general grammar, which would be, it's essentially vocabulary, and that's going to be, nouns, verbs, and that could be subject specific. So, you have a grammar for geography, you have a grammar for mathematics. And so essentially, yeah, I do. I teach that. And nowadays they do discourage teaching what we would call special grammar. Once upon a time, they would have called it philology, right, which has the suffix logos on it, the love of, it wasn't linguistic.
Well,
Linguistics is
philology is more the study of language itself, as in, its deep origins and going way back more than specific grammar, which deals with the components of language and writing sentences and structure and presenting, proper English, or the given language that you're dealing with at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. So, right. And so there was a historical component to philology, right? So that you studied the etymology. And so the roots of, the English is basically a German language with a Latin alphabet. You can trace that back to the Paleo Hebrew, the Phoenician, etc. And that would be philology. The linguistics now, which it's the same concept, but that's where you start getting into some of the deconstructionist stuff, relativistic stuff, where basically the concept of linguistics, Saussure, was that you didn't have to worry too much about the historical etymology or the growth of the language historically, the way it was used in the historical context, because basically they're just symbols, and you can make meaning out of any number of different symbols. We could make up a language today and we could make meaning with it. And so they kind of, what they're taking out of it is some of the logos, right? The formal logic, the first cause, the metaphysics. And so that's why I kind of like to distinguish philology and linguistics. But yeah, it's, we could call them both a type of special grammar for sure, right? And so when I teach the Research 102, I tell them basically that, your special grammar, we don't have a lot of time for it, but your general grammar is important for whatever you're researching, right? So if you can become familiar with the general grammar with whatever language you use, then you basically have the basis for using deductive reasoning to basically explore that subject, right? You don't necessarily have to have a degree in science to study science or the arts for that matter, right?
Well, and in fact, a lot of times the trivia method surpasses that, and we've found numerous problems with the scientific method itself. I did a show over a year ago regarding revamping the scientific method itself. And, it's just like the peer review system is more of a method of keeping dissenting opinions out than it is a way to fact check proper research and verifying research. So, it's maintaining the status quo rather than, and keeping out dissenting opinions rather than a way to make sure that research is solid. And, I've seen that a lot in my own case. Like when I started exposing my research on MKUltra and whatnot back in 2012, back then I was working with several dozen professors in ethnomycology and ethnobotany, and they all within a week came out against me, name calling and whatnot, and telling me how I didn't bring my papers for their peer review, and dismissing name calling at me and dismissing the research, but they couldn't address one single one of the primary citations in the actual research. And that was when I realized that there was a lot of, BS going on with the peer review system and what was going on in the whole field.
Yeah, certainly the peer review system. I mean, so these journals, right, are oftentimes sponsored, by, either foundations or sometimes even companies. So, there's several layers to, right. I mean, the other agenda, right, as opposed to the objective, discovery of truth for sure. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's get into your material here. Why don't we talk about, let's get into curriculum.
Okay. Yeah. So since we can segue from trivium to curriculum by talking about, since we started on special grammar, that's one thing that like I mentioned, they discourage kind of teaching, even I teach at the college, community college level. And so, not everybody is ready for college level courses when they come. And so you have to teach them what's called developmental, is what they call it sometimes. It's essentially a high school level course to catch them up to pace. Even in those courses, the prevailing pedagogy is to suggest that they call it skill and drill. So the special grammar study is not gonna have a bunch of great outcomes. They're not gonna learn much from it. Is the theory that they have. And maybe there's data that shows that. But what that stems from is essentially a shift from what they call the phonics method, right? You sound out the alphabet so that essentially once you can do that, you can phonetically read anything, even if you don't know the meaning of it. You just need to maybe have a dictionary handy, but you can phonetically understand the vowel sounds, the morphemes. They replaced what's called phonics with what's called the look-say method, okay, also known as whole language learning or whole word learning. So instead of learning the roots and the prefixes and the suffixes of a word to be able to break it down into its components and understand what it means in the context of the sentence, essentially you have to recognize the entire word as a character, right? An ideogram, essentially like a Chinese language, or like maybe even the cuneiform, right? Some of the Egyptian stuff. And so, there's studies that say that that the students learn faster over time or at the earlier stages with the look-say, but then there's studies that say over time, right? That kind of ends, right? I mean, when you start getting into more complex vocabulary, especially if you're doing like science-based vocabulary that uses a lot of Latin and Greek roots and things like that, it's hard to pick up. And so that actually segues with what we'll call the stimulus response method. And that's essentially education psychology.
Right. That sounds like Skinner right there.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's, Skinner's, that's operant conditioning, which is just basically, the next a little spin on what John B. Watson called behaviorism. And then that's just basically a spin on classical conditioning, which is Pavlov, which comes out of Wilhelm Wundt's stimulus response stuff. But it's all essentially the same idea, right? It's essentially to remove logos at a certain level. It's to basically appeal to the instinct or to the nervous system. And so instead of breaking down the word into its because even a grammar, right, even a word that has an alphabet with roots and suffixes and prefixes, that has a logos as well, right? There's a logic in terms of how those parts go together. And so that requires the application of the logos, right, the thinking mind, as opposed to just recognizing this character and then you're responding to it with excuse me, with a limited interpretive lens, and so a lot of that kind of segues with, just getting away from academics in general, which is the cultivation of the higher mind in pursuit of objective truth, and replacing that essentially with career pathways, workforce training type stuff is some of the buzzwords.
Right.
They use
Yeah. And now they're not even now they're moving away from actual education, and you've got all of this emotional nonsense learning and promoting social conditioning, social engineering, promoting the destruction of the family and whatnot by promoting, and eugenics by promoting transgender and homosexuality and things like that, even to kids in kindergarten that don't even have sexual thoughts yet, so now they're getting into nonsense that they shouldn't even be discussing at all. It shouldn't even be on the table. And it's really shifted in that regard in the last 4 or 5 years to where they're just, promoting pure hyperbole.
Well, interestingly, right? I mean, I teach all sorts of people, right? I mean, I want all the gay students to feel comfortable.
Well, sure, but what I'm getting at is there's been a whole movement and there's a Jaffa memo from Planned Parenthood, and I'll just pull that up right now, that discusses how they're going to heavily promote homosexuality and whatnot. Excuse me. And and I'm showing that document on screen, and it says encourage increased homosexuality. The reason for that is they're trying to when you understand it in terms of socialism and communism, you have to have a weak family and a strong government. And the way to do that is to promote things that end family and especially extended family so that people are reliant upon the government. And so when increased homosexuality, one, it's eugenics. Two, the people behind this, and we're going to get into Aldous Huxley, et cetera, here soon. But, Aldous Huxley was behind promoting these ideas so that as a Fabian socialist, so that he could get people caught up into socialism. If you don't have children, family, extended family, you don't have a support network. So then the government becomes your mommy and daddy support network. And so that is the whole idea behind that. And so, going back into the 50s and 60s, they admitted that they were going to heavily promote all of this stuff. And then you see Agenda 21 and whatever they've renamed it to now, promoting it even more heavily over the last 4 or 5 years. So they want to increase homosexual activity and transgender activity as much as possible. That is part of the agenda that they're selling.
Yeah, so part of it, you said a few things there. So one of it is, you brought up Brave New World, and so some of it just has to do with sexuality as a form of keeping you down in the passions all the time, right? And so another one has to do with, so if you're not engaged in reproductive relationships, that's that helps Malthusian eugenics, certainly. Where I was going to say though was where I was going with that was that, I have to say that philosophically there's a whole school called queer theory, right? And queer theory is essentially, it's a refutation of existentialism, right? And existentialism is just a refutation of essentially rationalism, which is just a refutation of logos, right? Truth and God and things like that. And so,
right, and that's what it's always about, and inverting everything to take people away from logos and natural law.
Yeah, yes, and so the other part of it is, essentially, there is. If essentially there is no biological basis to your sexuality, then there is no biological basis to your human identity in a way that essentially what's the difference between you and any other sort of raw material that you can sort of rearrange?
Right. And there's not 6,500 differences between male and female that are actually biological. It's, if I put on a dress and a wig, I'm a woman. This is the logic of the left these days. When I was a kid, if you wanted to be someone else, you put on underoos and ran around the backyard, and you didn't force anyone else to participate in your delusion. Whereas today they pass laws where if somebody wants to put on underoos and pretend they're Superman or a woman or a man or whatever, the rest of society is required by law to then support that delusion.
And that's kind of what I guess I was kind of the distinction I wanted to make. I don't have a problem tolerating anything, but to be able to be forced to say that philosophically that makes sense to me, on the spectrum of classical logos to rationalism to empiricism to skepticism to existentialism to basically what they call queer theory and then transhumanism. It is essentially it goes in that direction.
And who created the term transhumanism?
Oh, Julian Huxley. It's called New Bottles for New Wine, right?
Right, Sir Julian Huxley, our favorite eugenicist to expose here. And, of course, he wrote, what was it, the new theory, or the new synthesis, or the new synthesis, or the new synthesis for Darwin's hyperbole, and then his grandfather, Thomas Henry Huxley, was the propaganda manager for Darwin as well. And so then, what they want the liberals to believe is that we're evolving out of a sexless state. Obviously, if you don't reproduce or have a family, there's no evolution. Your tree gets cut off, the branches get cut off and thrown in the fire. But but what they do is they sell it as the antithesis of what it is.
Yeah, and interestingly too, talking about a lot of contradictions, here, and the term evolution doesn't even come from Darwin. That's Hegel's term. That's essentially the term he uses for his synthesis of the dialectic, right? So thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Nowadays, some people call it problem, reaction, solutions when it's manipulated. And essentially, philosophically, there's two premises here, that two things can be in contradiction and they can both be true at the same time. But also, there's another level to it that over time, those contradictions synthesize into this higher state, right? And so this is the idea of Marxism. It's just a material conception of it instead of idealistic. But so, it's essentially what we're talking about here as well. And in Brave New World, Chapter 1 is all about biology, and basically, essentially, what I would call the eugenics chapter. But the second chapter is all about psychology, and it's essentially all about the behaviorist method. One of the main characters in there is Helmholtz Watson. That's a reference to Hermann von Helmholtz, German physicist and philosopher that kind of had some roots in the stimulus response method. And then you got John B. Watson, the American behaviorist there. And so what you get with transhumanism, instead of nature versus nurture, right? So, the eugenicists that thought you could get to the new man through genetic engineering, and then you had the behaviorists that thought that you'd get to the new man if you structured your environment perfectly enough to condition everybody. Transhumanism essentially combines those two into what's called epigenetics, and then also what I'll just call neurobehaviorism or neurogenetics. And
right.
The idea that
and what I just wanted to ask you, since you mentioned the new man, what was the new man originally versus this crap that they're pushing on everybody now? Do you know?
I'm not quite sure I understand.
Okay, so originally the new man was someone who was born into Logos through following truth, right? And so this helped you raise up to a higher level of being. So what they've done is they've tried to invert that into their satanic spin to take us, to birth the new man, not through Logos, but through moral relativism and through, there not being any truth in the world. It's like going to Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception. You don't understand the world around you through your five senses. You have to shut off the five senses and, go within. So it's a constant loop without understanding truth, without understanding that reality is real. And then, so it's a direct inversion again. But then, this is birthing the new man through ignorance and moral relativism and through social engineering and socialism rather than through truth and Logos.
Yeah, and a lot of it comes from essentially what I'll say is, when we talk about Logos, we mean in some ways we're focusing a lot on deductive reasoning. Some of this stuff, as you mentioned,
it could be inductive also. I mean, I've covered this going way back with David Harriman, back in 2011. There is a way, we can go inductive as well, but yeah, mostly.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. And I don't mean to discount that, induction doesn't work, right? But induction has to happen on certain first causes and certain first principles. Okay. In order for you to induct something, you have to know that there is some consistency. So, some people would say that moral relativism kind of starts with the existentialists, skepticism, but I would say that it starts with the empiricists, because the empiricists essentially tried to induct, and this is Francis Bacon, David Hume, these types of guys, they tried to have inductive reasoning without a first cause, right? Hume's one of these guys that says that you can never experience a future moment. You can only, once you've experienced it, is now a present moment. So you can never really know that the future will behave in the same way as it did before. This basically, he is doubting cause and effect at a fundamental level, right?
And then you just throw a rock at their head and see if they duck or not, and find out,
Right, absolutely.
Physics is suddenly going to change. But this gets into from the Bible, like Titus 1:2, God cannot lie. You can have no contradictions in nature. A contradiction is always a lie or an error. And once you understand that, then you can grasp that, reality is always going to be real. And when you work from that axiom that reality is real and that we cannot have any contradictions in nature, suddenly it takes the weight off your back that the world is a reflection of yourself, and which is primacy of consciousness. And then it gives everyone the right to live and behave as they wish, rather than, oh well, if you carry a gun for defense, you're just bringing that negative energy on you. Or if you have a spare tire in your car, you're just wishing for a flat tire. Or if you have a first aid kit, you're wishing to get injured. This is the type of mentality that the leftist primacy of consciousness promotes. But when you pull it back and accept the axiom that reality is real, and that everyone has their own right to exist and act through their own agency as they wish, then suddenly we can begin to see reality itself, and what people like the Huxley family have been trying to cover up for, several generations.
And this is where the inductive method, without roots in a first cause and some of the first principles from formal logic, that induction ends up in like you said, in this realm of, it's, there's numbers in mathematics that aren't so there's like numbers that represent a complete infinite set. All right, that's right, fundamentally a contradiction. So when you start playing quantitatively, inductively with stuff like that, you're in the realm of the occult, right? You're in the realm of like turning off your own reason. You're doubting the ability of your own mind to know truth, essentially, right? You have to have these abstractions, and you're out there in like Gnostic land, basically, like La La Land, essentially. And so the basis of it is essentially to cut off logos. Rhetoric has, there's three parts of how we can express what we want to say. There's logos, right, which is logic, and there's ethos, which is essentially to establish trust, okay, character, credibility, things like that. And then there's pathos, which is emotion. Okay, Aristotle conceived that your soul was basically broken up like that as well. So you had the thinking mind, right? You had the feeling part of you, the pathos, right? And then you had the doing part, the will, which is the ethos, right? That's your character. So, without those first causes, what you're essentially doing is living in a realm where you're essentially trying to justify your own will based on your own passions,
right,
without any logos.
Right. Well, and do what thou wilt is the whole of the law, and Islam follows will rather than logos. And they're under the spell of Muhammad's will. Literally, that's what is halal. And that's a whole other discussion that we've already, covered on the show this year. But once you understand logos versus will, you get the whole foundation of it all, essentially.
Well, and Nietzsche's thing was will, right? Essentially that was one of his. Nietzsche's a funny guy. In some ways, I kind of like him. Even though he was kind of a madman, and he had no first causes, in essential. But in a lot of ways, his philosophy kind of came out of this malaise that of what the things that Hume and guys like that did. He kind of hated that he couldn't, for whatever reason, actually have faith in logos. And this is a guy who eventually goes crazy. Essentially, some of his first principles are will, courage, brave. Some of those things are kind of admirable in a certain sense. But without that first cause, some people would say it was from the syphilis. That's this. As people speculate that. But there was somebody beating a horse out in the street, and he essentially, he just melted down. So where was will there without some kind of objective truth? And so, in Brave New World, there's at the end of it, the world controller he's got Helmholtz Watson there, he's got Bernard Marx there, and then he's got John the Savage there. And essentially, Watson is a propagandist, and he wants to make art, and he wants to make poetry. He's like, he feels like there's something there's a truth I can express with these words, but he can't figure it out. And the savage, right, who was on this reservation, he had access to the Bible and Shakespeare and stuff like that. And so, he knew about like families, truth, beauty, right, God, stuff like that. And he tries to kind of explain, like, this is what you're trying to get at, Helmholtz. This is what you want to express. And Helmholtz laughs at him. He thinks it's absurd. And when they're in front of the world controller, the savage says, yeah, what Helmholtz, he says, that stuff is drivel and it's stupid and all of that. And he says, hey, you're not being very nice to your friend Helmholtz. And Helmholtz says, well, it's true. And the guy says, no. Well, world controller says, it's the highest form of art because you're creating art based on just sensations. And it's essentially what we're talking about, right? I mean, this is most music nowadays, right? I mean, it's a lot of, it's a lot of pop culture.
Right. It's
TV
not
stuff.
The quadrivium. It's, it's degraded. It's the most basic animal level instinct, sex, drugs, rock and roll, boom, 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 repeat. And that's, the electronic dance music and all of this crap. And, I used to go to rave parties and whatnot, and now I just look at that stuff and I can't even believe I ever walked in the door of one of those things. It's just complete garbage. But it's to break us down to the most basic animal level and to corrupt our minds, whereas the trivium and quadrivium brought us, in the 1700s, ending in the late 1800s, brought us to the highest level that humankind had ever been through, classical music and, all of the higher level arts, painting and whatnot. And then now we have abstract painting and modern art where, a woman menstruates on a piece of canvas, and then that's called art. Or you have Duchamp, signing his name on a urinal and calling that nonsense art. It takes no talent whatsoever, right? Or you splash some paint on a board, but you don't need the basic or the core understanding of how to paint and how to create higher level art. It's just all the most basic, animal-like instincts. A monkey and an elephant can create that level of art. So, that's where people are at now. We've lost our education.
You can look at, I do this with the students sometimes, in chapter 3 on Brave New World, I teach it, right? I teach it with the research class. And in chapter 3, there's a split narrative. All the other chapters, it's a linear narrative. In chapter 3, there's two narratives happening and he's jumping back and forth. And it's neat because at some points, it's, when you switch from one scene to the other, there's these double entendres. It means one thing. If it's part of the other narrative, it means something else. It's part of this narrative. And it's neat like that. But something else he was playing with was modernism, right? And it's essentially, the analog and the visual arts would have been something like cubism, okay? And essentially, it's this idea that what we're talking about, it's the removal of logos, right? Yeah.
I was just going to say, somebody just said something funny. I Belong in the Kitchen just said, you just have to identify as an artist, right? It's like I identify as a goat or a girl or an old woman or anything. You just put on a wig and and a dress or whatever, and that makes you the other thing. You don't have to be actually anything with any real experience or understanding, biological or learned or otherwise. It's just, you're just going to identify as an artist. And, art has become what gets the most shock and the largest reactionary shock out of the audience, rather than it being about the quality of the art itself.
Yeah, and this goes back to the idea, right? You're just stimulating the passions, which goes back to the whole idea of stimulus response, right? And working at basically that lower brain level.
Yeah, right? The natural, going all the way down to the natural man, rather than working our way upward, So, it doesn't matter if it's EDM music or, menstruating on a canvas, which, there's actually, like there was a woman in China a couple years ago. That was her art. She menstruated on paper in public, and then that was her masterpiece.
Well, I mean, this is on a progression, kind of what as I suggested, from, we go from, classical logos to rationalism, down to what we call queer theory and then transhumanism. You can do the same thing with art. So you can look at some of the classical stuff around the Renaissance. The Byzantine stuff was largely Platonic, okay, and it always usually was something pointing upwards, higher, was a little abstract. But then during the Renaissance period, you got some realistic stuff, right? And it started to look more realistic and more realistic until you got to Impressionism. And so it's the idea of, right, empirically, you're measuring. And when you measure stuff smaller and smaller, it becomes blurry, just like an impressionist painting, right? So from far away, when you look at the actual patterns that are there, the logos of how all the different pieces work together, you see people and you see animals and you see a landscape. But if you keep getting up close and you just look at the individual data points, it just looks like dots everywhere. You move forward to cubism, which basically is an extension of that, except instead of largely trying to make a picture with the data points, you're trying to blur what could be a picture with lots of dissonance, right? Oversecting lines, hard angles, right? Looking at two sides of someone's face at the same time. And then you keep going out there into the more abstract until you go into essentially the profane. It's just inverting everything for the sake of inverting it, right?
Right. Well, that's what Satanists do by definition. They go through the Bible and they say, oh, this is how you build an upright high society. Let's invert that and try to wreck it. It's like Marxism and Aldous Huxley's Fabian socialism and all this stuff. Their idea is that through eradicating all morality and promoting, pedophilia, bestiality, homosexuality, transgender, etc., not having family values or anything of the sort, this will, through Marxist theory, somehow create a utopia through the ultimate destruction of society, rather than creating a natural utopia through logos.
Yeah, and in Brave New World, the idea of inversion is essentially, we can trace this back to when Saint Augustine essentially became a Christian, right, and moved from Manichaeism, became Christian. It was actually he looked at Plotinus. I think it was Ambrose that gave it. It was Athanasius or Ambrose. I always get them mixed up. It was one of those apostolic fathers that gave him. He said, look at, Augustine was kind of confused with Manichaeism. He knew it was, the duality wasn't where it was at. And so Ambrose or Athanasius, whichever it was, gave him Plotinus to look at. And Plotinus, one of the principles, it's Neoplatonic, but the idea, one of Plotinus's concepts was that the good is first and everything has to come after that. Or, you and I might say something like the truth is first, and then, falsehood can only be created by an inversion of the truth. And so this is the nature of, if you're not with logos, the only thing you can do with it is invert it. You can't create something outside of it. You can only invert it. And so literally in Brave New World, they take the crosses. They can't get rid of the religious spirit altogether. They know that that's part of the human condition, the human psyche, the human soul, human brain, if you want to use their analog. So what they do is they chop all of the tops of the crosses off, and they make them T's, Model T's, for instead of our Lord, it's our Ford. It's this big allusion to corporatism and fascism and stuff like that.
And that's just the Brave New World, but don't forget Aldous Huxley and the 60s counterculture and the whole peace thing, because what is the peace symbol? It's the inverted cross with the the T snapped down, and so we will, it's not peace through logos or truth, it's peace through, it's like these these stupid coexist bumper stickers that you see people, with on the back of their cars, not grasping. And I'm not talking about the NRA one. That one's actually good. But, with all of the religious symbols on the back of their cars and coexist. And then you go in and you look at, Islam and 51% of the Quran is about killing and subjugating all non-believers. It's like, wait, how do we coexist with that? These are drastically different belief systems, and they do not belong in the same culture, hemisphere, planet, etc. But again, Islam is based on Allah being will, whereas Christianity is based on logos or truth. So and when people think that Christianity and Islam follow the same God, that is complete nonsense. But we digress quite a ways. We should probably get back to some of the stuff on your outline here.
Oh, that's okay. I mean, like I said, we could jump off because I do get into Brave New World in the book. I mean, that's one of my, and philosophically it relates to the transhumanist stuff. But yeah, I mean, I guess it's to segue, the stimulus response stuff. Essentially, the idea is, with all of the transhumanist stuff, it's essentially to create this technological bubble where you can where they think you might be able to get away with having, where you could justify your passions with your will without logos. If they insulate themselves, right, with enough, brain computer interfaces is what they call them, that somehow that'll work, right? I mean, that, because it won't work if they just try to live in contradiction, right? Yeah, I mean, we can jump to another one of those bullets
Sure.
in there if you want. Yeah.
Sure. Get into pedagogy and philosophy of education there.
Yeah.
Did we already cover? Did we already cover trivium enough, or you want to go deeper? Trivium and quadrivium, etc.
I think that's good. I mean, I actually think pedagogy wise, we kind of talked a lot of. I mean, a lot of it has to do with the removing of. I mean, language arts is pretty much integral to logos. I mean, logos, one of the interpretations is word, right? And so it is in some way the countervalence to the quantitative empirical method. Essentially, it might be better to jump to maybe governance.
Sure,
maybe the technology.
The one-room schoolhouse, parochial, compulsory. Yeah, I mean, and then this is something that's really interesting, and I've talked about it on the show many times. Back in the 1800s, the single-room schoolhouse ruled, and you have still a few of them left in very rural areas, but it's very rare now. And the eighth graders, for instance, taught the younger kids. And as you went through the process, you not only were learning, but you were teaching. And so by the time, people left eighth grade back in the 1800s, they had the equivalent of or more than your average bachelor's degree today. And people can't even get their minds around it. And they think that the single-room schoolhouse was an error and it was a silly thing in our educational history and whatnot. But no, that is actually key to a proper education.
I mean, it's organic, and I like the analog. I've done martial arts for almost 20 years now, and some of the best places I've trained is in a garage with a bunch of people that knew what they were talking about. Sometimes the institutional setting in general can take the life out of any art, but when you federalize it, make it compulsory, right, and then essentially standardize the curriculum across 50 states. The idea of having different states is to have some diversity of cultures and different, experiment with some different things here and there. And so, the idea that people in the Midwest and the East Coast and West Coast are going to want to have the same type of schoolhouse is, they would put it on the premise that is equality, right? To give everybody or to force everybody to have the same curriculum, but
right. Well, and then this promotion of diversity. Well, what's the root of the word diversity?
Well, to divide, right? To separate apart. Yeah.
Right. So we're going to divide people through diversity. I mean, it's right in the name that they use, and people actually think this means come together. No, it's to divide and to cause derision in the society. When you've got all of this liberal or Islamic stuff coming into the schools and education system, and everything is political correctness and whatnot. Everybody needs their safe space and whatnot. This isn't helping education. Nobody's learning critical thinking in school anymore. We're learning about how to think with our emotions and how not to offend anybody. Whereas, before, people understood that freedom of speech was, it was okay to be offended, and you learn and grew from it. Now everybody cries and gets their Depends diapers on and, goes and runs off into their safe space. They cannot handle critical thinking anymore. And in fact, critical thinking and logic have even been accused of being abusive now. I've heard that come across in the last 5-7 years as well.
It definitely is a lot of identity politics in academia, man.
Well, and I forgot to mention that you're an adjunct professor and you're in the classroom every day. So.
Oh yeah, and man, I get along with everybody. Like, people from all, like, people that I don't bring up all the conspiracy theory types. I don't even go there, right? I mean, I can't even talk transhumanism. I bring that up with a lot of people. People with higher degrees, they probably don't. Won't know what I'm talking about, and they'll be freaked out, right? If I show them the data, and and I get along with everybody, man. Like, but dude, the identity politics is exhausting sometimes. Like, and by the way, I didn't really pick up on it. Like I'm kind of late to some of this research type stuff, and but before I even kind of started looking at some of this, the other layers to this. When I started tutoring, I noticed, well, as an English professor, whenever you read something, you're supposed to interpret it through different lenses. That makes enough sense. I mean, there's, you could look at it through different angles. Okay, that makes enough sense. But, then I noticed that it was always race, class, gender, sexuality, race, class, gender, no matter what it was. And I thought maybe that's just English professors because, they're pretty left wing and they kind of, they think with the feelings more than the upper mind. Sometimes they're artsy. But then when I was tutoring, students would come in the sciences, history, every department, and all the assignment sheets would have that same. You had to talk about, if you're doing a colonial history, you had to talk about sexuality in 17th century, whatever. And so. Then I noticed it was like, okay, so this isn't just like a department thing. This is somehow a college-wide thing. And that was just my, just kind of like this, what's up with that? And then, as you and I have, read, it's, a lot of that comes from, foundations, companies, right? This transhumanist, eugenic, industrial complex, so to speak. And so, yeah, it's and like I said, I mean, I let everybody express whatever they want. When a student writes a paper, I tell them this: as long as they write short papers, man. So they don't even have to have the greatest thesis. They just don't contradict yourself by the end of it, and provide me some form of evidence, so a fact, statistic, quote, or other example, right?
Right. And, well, I mean, they should have to do the whole process of who, what, where, when, why, and how, and go through the whole thing and have a way to substantially prove their argument, and in the process of going through that, they should have to learn that, hey, if my thesis is wrong, I'm going to have to rewrite it so that it comes out to be truthful by the end.
Oh yeah, and but you'd be surprised, maybe not, but it's interesting because you get kind of a window into the mind when you sit down and go over a paper someone wrote with them, because they don't always see the contradictions somehow. And to me, that's odd, because it's like, how do you move forward with it? And I'm not saying like subtle things that don't line up, because rhetorically, you don't have to, it's not like formal logic where with one of your premises is wrong, the whole thing falls apart like an equation. You could have, a fact here that's not so good or bad. It doesn't destroy necessarily your thesis. But like, if you go to the total opposite of your thesis, I mean, literally at 180, and then be like, and they're like, where? And you show them, and then it's like, oh. And so, I mean, I let them rewrite their papers, so they usually do. I mean, that's I think that's why I've never.
How often are students honest enough to be willing to admit they're wrong and rewrite everything?
If they're failing the class, a lot of them. You know what I mean? If they know they need to pass, they will
I mean,
rewrite.
do they hold
Yeah.
on to the ideologies, or do they actually, come about and learn, that the evidence that you base your arguments on the evidence and not on your emotions of what you want something to be?
Yeah, some people would probably never get that far, but I mean, some people you can see, you know what I mean? And I don't hold, it's like, okay, it's like, hey, dude, do you see how your thesis is this, your enthymeme is this, and look at how these other claims are essentially the opposite. And then, they'll be like, oh, okay. And so they'll go back and rewrite. And I won't tell them, hey, you have to change your thesis. I tell them you have to either find some better evidence or maybe change, I put it out there, but I tell them, I'm not going to say, hey, change your thesis, right? So it's always up to them. But it's usually the carrot and I'm doing the stimulus response on them with holding that revision grade out there. But it's better than just whack, because I hold them to a high standard. They all, that's one thing they all say is I grade hard, but I've never had somebody at the end say I didn't deserve the grade I had, because they all know they could have rewrote it. And so they at that level, I think they all do understand a certain logos that, you know what I mean? People, I've been teaching for 10 years, and people get grade disputes pretty often. I mean, it doesn't have to be your fault, because the student might just not like you for whatever reason. But
Well,
I think
one of the biggest problems I see is people have a really hard time differentiating between third hand, second hand, and primary evidence of something. They think that, what somebody writes or says is as valid as the actual proven fact of a primary citation. So if I go to it, and I've tried to explain the difference between third, secondary, and primary citations on the show a number of times, but people think that if they read a book where somebody is talking about something else, that's as good as going to the something else as the primary source. And it's not. You have to go to the original source and verify if this secondary source is even telling the truth. In academia, I'm sure you've seen this. You get these professors and these peer reviews and journals that circle jerk themselves, where they all cite each other, and all of them, you're laughing, all of them avoid going to the primary citations. They all just cite each other, and then they act like what they've written is proved, right? Rather than getting all the way down. And the biggest thing that these people hate is when you see their little circle jerk going on, and you go to the primaries and you fact check them, and you realize the whole lot of them are full of crap. And that's the fastest way to debunk. It doesn't matter if it's 5, 10, 20, 50, 100 professors. I've seen whole cells of these guys doing this stuff, and as soon as I see that, usually that clues me in that something is up, and that their information is wrong. They shouldn't all be citing each other. They should each be citing the primary documentation, the primary facts, the primary sources. And so, that's always the quickest way to disprove something, but they're not going to teach the kids in college this, right? Because that gives up the whole gig.
Yeah, well, so there's two things that you guys go on there. One is the idea, right? Understanding between a first-hand, second-hand source, right? Now, in the schools where I teach, we don't have the biggest library, so sometimes the secondary source for them is the best they can get. But you're right.
Well, we do have this thing called the internet these days.
No, yeah, absolutely, right.
Here's the thing: is I've gone online, not found something, and then traveled to a university archive and sat there reading through personal letters and archival documents for weeks just to get the proof of, or the primary evidence of something, and that's what you have to go to. Until you get the primary that actually substantiates your argument, you don't have it, and then, what is third-hand evidence? That's someone talking about the person talking about the primary evidence. So, it's just, it's a bunch of, hearsay. And so people today actually believe that second and third-hand hearsay is as valid as proof, as primary documentation.
Oh yeah, no.
Look at the Trump impeachment trials as evidence of that. You have you have all of this, hearsay stacked on top of hearsay on top of hearsay and no primary evidence, and then they all dance around it like they have actually provided evidence. Right, anecdotal.
Yeah, and then you talked about the your colorful analogy there, the circle event, the circular event there. I got an example of that in the book, which is sorry, which is I believe it's Intelligence, the journal called Intelligence, and there's a bunch of people in there. And I don't want to say them off the top of my head because some of them aren't still on there. But I will just throw out some of the people. They all are in the bibliography of the bell curve. It's essentially, and if you trace them back, they're essentially go back to this thing called the Pioneer Fund, and a half of his other citations are all old eugenic stuff. Like Friedrich Osborne, the old military eugenic stuff. The IQ data from there, and so when you looked at the board, I think one of them was Godfredson, Linda Godfredson, and then there's a couple other on it. But yeah, Intelligence, and it was just like as I was looking up, that's one of those, the bell curve, you can kind of dig in the back of that, and you can just look at the citations on it. And you just look at, it's one of those circular events there. You look at all these people, and I've dug through all that old eugenic stuff, Human Betterment Foundation, American Eugenics. I mean, they actually had a bunch of those books in the library at Eastern where I went to college, and so I used to go and dig because when I didn't learn about eugenics until my senior year of college, which is kind of embarrassing, I mean, I didn't know what that word was, right? All this Hitler's bad stuff that you see all the time, and never heard that word. And that's really what got me started on my journey in this realm of research, because it's wait, I'm about to have my degree. And how did I not know this? And I heard it on some of these wacky conspiracy theory websites. My friends were saying, it's this is crazy. I says, if that's real, it'll be in the library. And so I'm like, what are you talking about? And as I mentioned, every class had this, this racial justice component to it. And, and I was, very much all about that stuff. I mean, still am, by the way, my life is black. So it's not like I'm not a racist or something like that. But
that's just the easiest card to use by the emotionally driven to avoid any research. Oh, you used facts. You're a racist. You're a Nazi. What do they call that? There's a specific term for it. Let me see if I can find it. It's called Godwin's Law. Right. And so Godwin's Law is, and I'll just read this really quickly. It's pretty funny. An internet adage asserting that as an online discussion grows longer, the probability of a comparison involving Nazi or a Hitler approaches 1.
So it's like you're bound to go down that dialectic.
Right. Well, I mean, they're going to force it just because if you're presenting any sort of facts, you're going to be called Nazi, Hitler, racist,
Well, right, okay.
Whatever.
So what I was trying to do was point out the contradictions in the racial justice theory of what was being pushed. Yet I never heard about eugenics from these people, right? And so what I'm trying to point out is the total opposite. And now I'm defending against something because I'm pointing out its contradictions, right? So, right. I mean,
well, yeah, of course. That's the agenda, because what they do is invert everything. So that's what they have to do to deflect and divert.
Well, and that's what I mean by the identity politics stuff is exhausting, because it's and that's something that it's do I have to why does my character matter when we're talking about issues, I guess, you know what I mean? Ideas and issues. And, hey, I'm not a perfect guy. Nobody is, right? So,
no.
But so
all we can try to do is follow Logos to the best of our example, right? Or to the best of our ability. And then Jesus being the ultimate example of trying to live in truth and trying to understand what Logos is.
Well, and that's the thing that people, a lot of the people that wanted to refute the formal logic and logos and God and all that is the idea that, well, you can't know that, you can't know that. Well, you're right, but I don't have to know that. All I have to know is when I have to find the contradictions in my own life, right? I don't have to know the contradictions in the entire universe. That is not my place.
Well, here's the thing, and you can actually, when you have that epiphany moment, you know that you've hit logos. But when you're researching something, when you've removed all of the contradictions and you have that aha epiphany moment, that's when you've hit logos, and you have the truth on that topic. And then if other people can bring you data, grammar after that over time. And if you see a new contradiction, generally if you've gone through all of the who, what, where, and when, if somebody brings you something new, you can look at it and say, does it fit? Or, I've already actually discounted that. But, without having the trivium and understanding this basic premise, people think, like when I write a paper, I'll get 1,000, 2,000 people send me the exact same argument against my work, and each one of them will think it's original, that their thought or claim is original, and I just don't want to hear them out, right? When I've already discounted their so-called evidence, which is, like let's say if I write a paper on MK Ultra and psychedelics, their argument would be, oh, well, psychedelic mushrooms are older than the CIA. Therefore, false conclusion, non sequitur, they can't be bad. They have to be the true source of religion. Or you've never tried them, right? And so you have, which of course I have, and I've written books and papers on all of this. But, they all use the exact same emotionally baseless arguments to try to hold up their false arguments, and every single one of them uses the exact same false premises, and every single one of them thinks that their thought is actually original, and every single one of them doesn't read the research before they present this nonsense as well, because they can't, like your students, they don't have the intellectual integrity to admit that they might be wrong on something and have to change an opinion based on actual evidence.
Well, a lot of times I think, you've probably been in, some of the people you're talking about as far as,
John in the chat, John in the chat just said it's your fault that I'm having cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, a lot of this stuff is like, it goes back to the identity politics stuff, right? And so like you can kind of, sometimes with some people, you start a conversation, like especially in academia, before I broach any controversial stuff, I like to pose it as a question that I heard somebody else talk about, right? You're like, hey, you ever hear about this? And you can kind of gauge early on, like whether or not that person is gonna have a conversation, without a pre-drawn conclusion, and kind of just not spar with you necessarily, but go back and forth in dialogue. But you can tell other people. And you can kind of it's like a right-left thing sometimes, and then there's other categories that go along with it. First you can say, are they Republican or Democrat? And then there's those little other identity, which ethnic group do they identify with, which sexuality do they identify with? And then the box gets smaller and smaller until you really lack, this is where your general grammar can't break through, somebody's identity politics.
Right. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. They've created a box that they've pigeonholed themselves in, and the box is made out of pure lies, right? And so this is the identity politics. I'm an LGBT QWERTY because, it used to be LGBT, then Q, and then QWERTY because they took over the whole keyboard. And, and it's what they identify with rather than identifying with facts and truth, finding the logos. And finding, and once you grasp that logos, truth, is God, and logos is where we get the word logic from, then you can, and logos is also reason, and then you can find a path, the way out. You can find a way out of this labyrinth of nonsense, but people are caught up with their labels and their identities rather than with logos and the truth.
And that's another thing in Brave New World too, right? They have the scientific caste system, which is and it's they put the students, the babies, and it's just in the second chapter. That's the one that's all about psychology. So part of it is excuse me, the behaviorist method, which is conditioning the nervous system through stimulus response. But then there's also the subconscious conditioning, which is essentially the Freudian stuff. And it's got all those allusions to Freud in there. But they put the babies to sleep, and then they put this what they call hypnopedia, and then they put these slogans in their ears, like basically like an ad jingle, and it says something like, "I'm a Delta, and I love being a Delta because I'm smarter than the Epsilons, but I'm not. I don't have to do all that hard work that the Betas and the Alphas have to do." And then they
right.
And that's it, right? And they said that was best for in the book they called it moral education, because essentially, right, it was something that we morally is something that we trust is the first cause, right? Morality, the first cause, God, and then we have an emotional attachment to the things that we trust, right? And so if you can get people to trust their caste system at the emotional level, then essentially, right, you have this amoral automaton that just performs their workforce function. And that can actually segue into, one of the things that I looked at the end was the social credit system in China, and it may be making its way here.
Oh yeah, well, rule by consensus rather than by facts and whatnot, and then you base everything on this identity politics and false information and what people want to identify through feel-good hyperbole, and then it goes back to the a million Frenchmen can be wrong and usually are, but all of this comes down to rule by consensus, and so you get people attacking someone just because their beliefs are different. Oh, you're a Christian. Oh, you voted for Trump. We're going to beat you up if you don't fall in line with our communist agenda, And then, it's like most people don't realize when you get into, for instance, the Nazi Party, most people don't realize that the Nazi Party was the, let me see here. I'm just looking for the name of it. It's usually right on the top here. The National German Socialist Workers' Party or whatever it was, but the Socialist Workers' Party. And so one thing the left never wants to admit is that the Nazis were leftists, There were socialists, and they were, fascism, socialism are both forms of Marxism, different levels of Marxism. But they want to avoid this whole thing when they're screaming their ad hominem attacks at everybody to avoid looking further at the truth. So screaming Nazi, screaming Hitler, screaming racist is part of their, and going back to Saul Alinsky and Rules for Radicals, but it's part of their consensus ruling, and that you were talking about with China.
Yeah, well, in Brave New World, it's all about social stability, right? And there's allusions to both communism, socialism, and fascism in there, and in that novel, right? There's Bernard Marx, but then there's also, they got the references to Ford, who was, buddy with Hitler, right? And funded a lot of that stuff and got awards from. So there's both of those things going on there. That's because both Marxism and fascism not only stem from socialism, but they both go back to Hegelianism, which is again this idea that the contradictions. And to jump back to the social credit system, that it's essentially a digital caste system that is essentially, in essence, what Huxley called his scientific caste system. Now, some people would critique the trivium and formal logic and classical logos and, all that type of stuff. They might say that once upon a time, that was that type of learning methodology held up the divine right of kings, right? And then there was this essentially this caste system like that. But
Yeah, and they'll
you
create
get
this
the
whole
same,
false argument based around it, right?
and you get to the same place with this, with empiricism either way. What do some of these people, you go from, either a metaphysical or so-called metaphysical caste system to essentially a scientific caste system to a digital caste system. And effectively, it's the same thing. What do you look at some of what these transhumanists, Kurzweil refers to himself as becoming a god. There's the Church of AI. I think it's called Way of the Future. So WOTF, which I think is a pun on what the F, right? And then there's, so you get going back to that analog with the art, right? You measure stuff so much to where it gets just as blurry in this world of empirical transhumanist science as it would be if you were trying to look out into, the heavens or the ether and tell me what Jupiter, looks like up there. I mean, it's essentially the same irrationality. But the horrific thing about the social credit system is that, there's no due process. It's in real time. Like, have you ever seen some of those videos where the people, not when they buy stuff, but when they put it in their cart, their score goes down or up depending on, if they bought beer or diapers, right? And essentially we're not, like, all they'd have to do is put in a law where they would say that they could do that, and they've already got the infrastructure put up here. I mean, everything is data mined cookies, and it's just transmitting it to each other nonstop all the time. So
I've been warning people about this stuff for years, as is Dr. Hans Utter, who's been on my show about 45 times. And yeah, I mean, it's so obvious that this is the direction that they're going. And then somebody just said that Tom Steyer, who's running for president right now, he's the billionaire that was under Obama. He's a big-time communist, but he creates the rating systems for movies for your kids, And then he also runs, helps fund these troll groups that run around the internet and scream Nazi or Jew whenever somebody brings up anything that they disagree with. He's the money behind these groups, like the GDL and some of these other groups, through his, what is his organization? Oh, goodness, now I'm forgetting. I'll have to look it up here. Hold on a second. Next Gen America, that's what it is,
okay.
And he's got this woman who used to work for him, Samaria Salazar, who's tied with all of these different groups. But they go around promoting these social engineering agendas, and anybody who doesn't fall a line, they use these tactics, But he's invested in China and elsewhere. So thanks for everybody in the notes or in the chat commenting on that. That's great point.
Oh, yeah, I should mention, I do, I got that website, schoolworldorder.info. So it's got basically, I got 2,000 citations. And so, anyone who wants to check on the citations, they're there. Most of them are links. I'm cleaning it up as I go. It's taking a while. So, any of the stuff I'm talking about with, I'm not good like you guys are with pulling up screen sharing and all that.
I've had this database going for almost 13 years now. So, it's got 10, 15,000 citations in it. So I can just pull it up and find
I've seen
stuff.
That map. It is really cool, man.
I've been working on that for a long time, so that's the only reason why. I used to work in IT back in the 90s, and I had to deal with a database when at this company I was the IT manager for, and so one time I printed out the database structure and posted it on my office wall, so I could figure out where everything was. And then I was sitting there, wow, I can map everything out this way, and that was...
Yeah, I like the graphic arrangement as opposed to just, I didn't have a list.
Right, so then that kind of gave me the idea of doing that. So I started the database, I think, in 2006 originally, and then 2007, I think, is when I moved it to the Brain software, and I've been using the Brain software since then. So it's, it works. It definitely helps keep thoughts organized that way.
Yeah, when I put stuff on the board, I try to be, geometry actually helps organize your language, right? Your trivium, that part of the quadrivium can help you graph out your trivium, your ideas, your words. Um, you know, to jump back to the social credit system, I'm gonna work backwards a little bit from here. Um, you know, people probably know, Elon Musk recently came out with that brain chip, right? The neural link, that brain computer interface. And by the way, they've got all sorts of different brain computer interfaces. I thought that was going to be the smallest part of the book. And, you probably know Jose Manuel Rodriguez Delgado at Yale was doing that in the 60s, late 50s, early 60s. And, so that's 60 years ago, right? And so the stuff they got now is way up there. But, that's the highest level of it. Kind of which will feed into that, which by the way will link into that smart city that's right tracks your social credit, is essentially these different education technologies which are going to data mine your biometrics and your psychometrics. Okay, and so that's in 3 layers essentially. One is the adaptive learning software, which is essentially looking at your cognitive behavioral stimulus response algorithms in response to lessons on a window on a computer module. Then you have the socio emotional learning biometric stuff. They're little wearables that essentially measure your affect, right? So your emotional level, your attention, your engagement. Some of that is facial recognition software, which looks at what affect you have based on your different facial expressions. Others are things called galvanic skin response monitors. They're little bracelets that look at electrical conductivity, heart rate, blood pressure. And then you have others that measure your EEGs, like one company is called BrainCo. So you wear this, they got them in China where they've been doing it. You put them on your head. But I saw them advertise the company on one of these Fox News venues. So I just, anyways. But it measures your EEG. And so, essentially all that data, is going to go into this super AI grid. And, that'll be part of your psychological profile. It'll get fed into this social credit system, right? And so your school system will pump straight into that. And so some people probably might be thinking like, well, how can the schools do that? Because school records have to be FERPA laws and private, and you can't, it's almost like medical records. They're that sensitive. There's no way you can do that, right? But in a lot of ways, they're already doing it, right? So some of those FERPA laws are real loose. The education technology companies, right, they might not have access to certain types of data. There's 3 layers of it. There's the personally identifiable information. That's like your address, your name, and stuff like that. But then there's systems information data, which has to do with basically school database stuff. But then there's other stuff that they call user interaction information. So that has to do with whatever algorithms they can anonymize based on your activity. So they can still put that in your school file and put it into your school record. The other problem is that there's an increase in what we call public-private partnerships in education. And that blurs the lines in between who can share what for the purposes of either improving the technology or administering some therapy to help the student. All right. And so, I'm working backwards. So it might not be as lucid as I could make it otherwise. But that's the relationship between the social credit system and, where the education technologies are kind of headed in that direction.
Well said. While you were talking, I was, I had looked up Nazi a bit ago, and it used to say under Nazism, National German Socialist Workers' Party or National Socialist German Workers' Party, whichever way it goes. But I noticed in the last month or two, since I showed that on screen in one of the shows, they've rewritten it and they've taken out, and let me show this on screen, they've actually taken out where it said German National Socialist Workers' Party. And so National Socialism here, or Nazi, National Socialism, National Socialism, and then in Germany and other far-right groups with similar ideas and aims. So it's a real stretch to call socialism a right-wing ideology. It's always been a left-wing ideology. But it's really interesting that they took that out because, when people get that it's, it's like the Labor Party in Great Britain or the Democratic Party here is National Socialism is leftism. And when you see Antifa and these groups going around beating anybody who disagrees with them, these are all leftist groups. This is the foundation of what Nazism is. Anyway, I just wanted to point that out because I was looking on the Wikipedia page. And it's like, where the heck did it go? They've rewritten it in the last couple of months.
Well, funny thing too is that another parallel that this. So we look at Hegelianism being part of both socialism, communism, fascism, but then so was eugenics. Eugenics was not like you'd think eugenics. Like Hitler is the the pinnacle of eugenics in its most horrific expression historically, and the thing with that is the leftists were all about it too, right? I mean, so people like Huxley himself identified as basically a labor guy, and then all his buddies at the Bloomsbury Group would have been people like Bertrand Russell, George Bernard Shaw, John Maynard Keynes, H.G. Wells. These guys are all considered liberals, right?
Right. Well, these guys were all tied directly with Aldous Huxley and the Fabian Socialists, etc. Right. So let's look at John Maynard Keynes.
Well, he gave a speech at the British Eugenics Society presenting the gold medal.
So here, I'm pulling it up here on the screen. Eugenics and Population Control, Fabian Society. He's a Century Club, which is a CIA front. British Eugenics Society. He was tied with Margaret Darwin Keynes. They're married in, but he was also tied to Gordon Wasson of the CIA's MK Ultra Subproject 58. But you look at the Fabian Society, and you get all of these people all clustered together, and these are who we're supposed to believe are right wingers. Of course, we see George Orwell there, H.G. Wells, Aldous Huxley. All of the same social engineers that we see.
You say George Orwell?
Well, George Orwell.
Like the Eric Blair George Orwell?
Yeah, that one. So here I'll bring that back. Well, see George.
Yeah, right.
He was Aldous Huxley's student.
That man I know. Yeah.
Right. So he was a Fabian socialist. He claims he came out against it later on. I don't buy it, but his was more of the physical control of the population in 1984, whereas Aldous Huxley believed that control would be done through barbiturates and hypnosis and more of social control. And obviously, the two really more came together than anything else. And then Aldous Huxley went on to be the head of the CIA, the head architect of the CIA's MK Ultra program.
Yeah, and he was also part of they called it the planning committee, the planning group. So during that time, right around the Great Depression, England was having its economic crisis, and they were trying to figure out what to do. This is the time Oswald Mosley and the British fascists are rising up, and Huxley was part of this committee where they sat and basically hung out with Parliament and stuff, and they call it planning. And what is that? It's just a neutral term. You call it fascism, you call it communism. It's essentially it's the merger of government and in the economy. It's the merger of the public and the private sectors. And this is essentially part of what I was talking about is leading towards this loose exchange of student data. We can jump back to where we talked about the evolution or the change.
Well, just so you know, we only got a couple minutes to go here. We should probably have you back for a part 2 sometime soon. What do you think?
Yeah, man, I'm up for it if you're cool with it. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
But I want to wrap it up here at the top of the hour, so we got about 3 minutes to go here. Why don't you give out any information you want so people can reach out to you?
Okay, so I got a website at schoolworldorder.info, and then the web or the email is excuse me, Taoist Professor TAOIST Professor @gmail.com. All right, so Taoist TAOIST, probably your audience knows that. And yeah, that's pretty much it. You know, if you want to get the book, you can go to that website and it'll take you to Trying Day. You know, yeah. Um, you know, best to buy it from Trying Day. We you know, Chris and I, you know,
You won't
get all
autograph
the.
it for everybody like you did mine, though, right?
I can do that if you request. I actually got some. Somebody wants maybe you know, autograph one. I think I can do some of those. Maybe, yeah, I can do that. I don't know
Cool.
how many I can do. First come, first serve, maybe 5. How about that? We'll say 5. It'd be fine.
Well, I appreciate your time. Let's get you on either, you know, sometime, you know, right before the end of the year or early next year. Obviously, we only got a few weeks left here of the year, but you know, I appreciate your coming on and appreciate your work. It was a good conversation tonight, and I'm glad we're hitting the same who and what and where and when type of information, right? So that's good to see. And please support the show, ladies and gentlemen. We can't do it without your support. Go to logosmedia.com and click on the donate button. You can also support through Patreon or through Bitcoin. And because we had to stop and restart the show earlier because the screen settings were off, I'll post the show notes here this evening, or the show description, and include the donation information there. But greatly appreciate your support. Please also hit the super chat if it's still up there for you. And anything else you would like to add before you wrap it up here, John?
No, just thanks for having me on, man. It was a good time, man. It was fun.
Definitely. So we'll talk to you again soon, and we'll see you then. And everybody keep warm. Hope you have a great holiday season this year, and hopefully you don't get stuck in a nasty blizzard like we did. I'd hate to see what other cities and towns look like that got that after us. But anyway, see you soon, and that looks like a good place to wrap it up. And good night, everyone.